Right, I've started the recording. I've recorded those of you who are here physically, and for those of you Zooming, I will use the Zoom participant list to mark that you were here. So I am keeping attendance, just not going to call the roll from in the future. Remember, your exam is Tuesday of next week. I have created the schedule that reflects when you took the exam last time. Just put in what people did last time, except for the people who took it at 3:30. It looks like there's room for you. I think the 3 people can take it at the regular class time. I will put that up. I've got it ready. I'll put that up right after class. So look at it. Some of you will be doing it the regular class time, some at 12:30, some at 2. So if there's a problem with that, I can make adjustments. But we'll start out from what we had last time. Any questions before we get into the material today? I'm sorry. I think we will get through chapter 30. We're not going to spend a lot of time on 30. We'll spend today on 29 and maybe a little bit of Thursday on 29. So we'll spend part of Thursday on 30, and I may create a short video over the part of 30 that we don't get to on 30. If we're going to go that way, I will have that up by Friday morning. But anyway, I'll give you more on that next time. I'm sorry. Then for the homework, just go through 30. Go through 30. Remember, we started with chapter 26 and 27. We covered 27 first, but we did not include that on the first exam. So for the second exam, you want to start with 26, 27, 28. Remember, for 28, I said I will only ask you questions very similar to what you found in the MRU videos, and then 29 and 30. Can I get somebody who's Zooming to say something so I know that you're actually hearing me?
I can hear you.
Can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Today, we are going to start with a very short review of what we did last time, what we've seen so far. We said that our material well-being, how we're doing in terms of standard of living, depends on the goods and services that we're able to produce. I'm not saying that our well-being is completely determined by material things, but certainly material things have an important impact on our well-being. And that material part of our well-being depends on the goods and services that we are able to produce. Because it's very important to remember something that's obvious, but that people seem to forget, which is we cannot consume anything until it's produced. Everything has to be produced. And so we're interested in, well, how much stuff are we able to produce this year? How does it compare with what we produced last year, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and so on? And we have developed the idea of the concept of GDP, gross domestic product, as our measure of the market value of the final goods and services produced annually during the year. We also saw that GDP, how much we produce, depends on a number of factors. One thing, remember, we talked about 2 approaches to calculating GDP. The first was the spending approach. Look at how much would you have to spend to purchase all that output. The other was the income approach, or the factor income approach. And there we're looking at how much income was generated as all of that spending was occurring. But then we, in chapter 28, we said, well, how much we can produce depends on the factors that we have, the resources that we have. And the solo model begins with a what function? A production function. Okay? And we use this equation to represent production function. Production function is just a function that shows the relationship between the amount of inputs that we have and the amount of output that we can get. And in our equation, our model, what did K represent?
Capital.
K, capital and physical capital. We sometimes talk about two kinds of capital. K represents physical capital, the stock of machines, tools, equipment, factories. Obviously, the more of those things we have, the more output we're going to be able to produce. EL represents human capital. And we said that you can think of that as education times labor. How many people do we have? And how much education do people have? So EL is human capital. That's really important. We need physical capital, but we have to have people who know how to use that capital, people who know how to think. So that factor is also important. That's why we have them up here in the production frontier. And then A stands for what? Ideas. Ideas or technical knowledge. The more technical knowledge, the more ideas we have, the more output we can get from the same inputs. Some people have a very negative, dim view of the future. They say, well, we're using up our natural resources, and so, we're going to produce less and less, and living standard, we can have problems. But while it is true that every year we do use up some of our natural resources, it is also true that how much output we can have depends on not only our physical capital, our natural resources, our human capital, it depends on ideas. And so when we get more ideas and better ideas, our ability to produce goes up. So even though every year, yes, we are using up some resources, there is no reason to have a negative, pessimistic view of living standards in the future. Let's think about it. We've been using up lots of resources over the last 100 years, and yet we're dramatically better off than people were in the past. And it's not just people in the US, around the world. People are better off now than they were 100 years ago, especially in the really, really poor countries. Their living standards have improved dramatically. And a big part of that has to do with ideas. We talked about the production frontier, the production function in the growth model. And this is just the graph that represents that production function. That upward slope is just showing you that as you increase the amount of capital that a country has, you can produce more output. And the green line, we made an assumption that as the country is producing more output, you're going to make more investment. You're going to build more new tools or create more new tools and more new factories, things like that. The red line was depreciation, which represents the capital that wears out. So every year, we're producing some new capital, we're losing some old capital, and our capital stock may increase or it may decrease, depending on whether we produce more new capital than old capital that we lost through depreciation. We said that or think about, where would a poor country be in this graph? Are they going to be over here, or are they going to be over here? They're going to be way on the left, because if the country is poor, you can bet they don't have much capital. So if they're down here with a low level of capital, that means they're going to have low living standards. But since they don't have much capital, that means if they invest, if they add to their capital stock, that new capital is going to have a very significant effect on output. The production frontier, production curve is very steep. So just a little increase in capital has a big effect on their output. So that's why we see countries like China that are starting with a very low level of capital. They have a high growth rate. They are catching up. They're behind in terms of capital stock. Whereas a country like the US that has much more capital, we are further to the right. That means we're somewhere up here. And you can see the curve is flatter, which means the growth rate of output is lower. So it's not surprising that poor countries tend to have higher growth rates than wealthy countries. Our model here suggests that for any given rate of investment and rate of depreciation, there's a steady state capital stock. That means that given enough time, we end up at this level of capital where the capital stock is going to be stable, because each year our investment is just sufficient to replace the capital that's wearing out through depreciation. So we would remain here, and that means the other things being equal, output would remain steady, and that means the growth rate would drop to zero. If capital accumulation was the only thing that affected output, then in the long run, we would end up at some fixed level of capital, some fixed level of output. We would not have any additional growth. Okay? That's why we said that ideas are so important. Because when we come up with new ideas, then that causes this whole curve to shift up. Okay? And so the improvement in technology, the addition of new ideas, means that economic growth can continue indefinitely. There's no reason that it has to stop. Okay? And they had an equation. I don't think I put it in here, but I think it's worth recalling, that you can think of the number of ideas we have as being a function of the population times the incentives to come up with new ideas times the number of ideas per hour. And this is just a crude equation, but it's trying to emphasize these are things that are important. As the population grows, the world population, there's no reason to think that's a negative thing, because each person is thinking. Each person has ideas. And as we have more trade, that tends to raise living standards. As living standards go up, that means you have more people who can engage in occupations where they actually get to think, rather than just working out in a field hoeing a ditch. So as you have more people, more trade, living standards go up, more people are able to think, and that means the number of ideas that people come up with improve. And that process can continue forever. There's no reason to think there's some fixed number of ideas that once we have all those ideas, there are no more. There's no reason to think that at all. So I would say there's reason for optimism. We certainly have lots of economic problems, and it's easy to get depressed thinking about some of those problems. that's why I think it's important to recognize that when we're thinking long term, there is reason for optimism. Just before we get into chapter 29, I'll give you a quote from a Nobel Prize winning economist, James Buchanan. And he one time said, when I think about the future, I become very pessimistic because I see all these problems and I think, how are we going to solve these problems? But when I think about the past, I become very optimistic. And what he meant was, like everybody, he sees the problems that we're dealing with in the present and that we think are going to happen in the future. And that we think, how are we going to solve these? But when he thinks about the past, he thinks, well, in the 1930s, how did the future look? Well, that was the Great Depression. And if you talk to somebody in the 30s and you said, the future is probably going to be a lot better, they would have said, you're crazy. The world is falling apart. Things are going to be awful. You talk to somebody in the 40s when the whole world was at war, and you said, well, the future is probably going to be a lot better, they would have said, you're crazy. If you talk to somebody in the 70s, when inflation was a huge problem and recession was a huge problem, people tended to be rather pessimistic about the future. And yet, we are far better off than we were in the 30s and the 40s and the 70s. In spite of the problems that we always have, things keep getting better. Not a guarantee that it will always happen, but if we have the institutions such as private property, courts, laws, police who can enforce the laws, governments that are interested in enforcing the laws, then we're going to have the incentives. We're going to have the ability to have lots of new ideas be produced, and there's good reason for optimism in spite of the very real problems that we see. Okay. Question or comment on any of that? Okay. To get into chapter 29, think for a moment more about our graph here. Okay? We've said that in terms of catching up growth, that depends on capital accumulation. That depends on the production of new capital. And new capital is produced when you have investment. When a business goes out and purchases a new machine or builds a new factory, that is investment. What we're going to get into in chapter 29 is how exactly does that investment work? When, say you have a business that wants to build a new factory. Let's say it's an auto company. They think maybe they're building, going to build a new kind of electric car. They think this is going to be very profitable. So they want to build this factory. But let's say that in order to build that factory, it's going to cost $3 billion. The person who owns the company and who has this idea, they have the idea, they know what they want to do, and they know how to do it, but they may not have $3 billion to pay for all of those resources they're going to have. So how does the person with the idea who wants to do the investing, how do they get the funds? That's what chapter 3 or chapter 29 is all about. It's about the role of the financial system in making it possible for investment to take place. And what we have to, some really important things we'll see here. One is that in order for there to be investment, there has to be savings. For somebody, for the auto company to invest $3 billion in that factory, there has to be somebody in the economy who's willing to provide those funds. And the only way you can provide funds is if you are saving. In order for investment to take place, you have to have someone who is willing to save. And saving is just income that is not spent on consumption goods. If your income is $20,000 and you're spending $18,000, well, then you've got $2,000 that you're not spending. So that means you are saving $2,000. And that $2,000 of saving can then be used to finance $2,000 of investment spending. For the investment to occur, you've got to have somebody saving the money. Okay? But you don't just have to have somebody saving. You have to have some means by which the people saving can get those funds into the hands of the businesses that want to invest. Okay? Maybe you've been saving and you've got $50,000 of saving. And maybe you've got this other person who wants to do an investment that's going to cost $50,000. If they need $50,000, you have $50,000. How does that money get from your hands into their hands? That is not a simple problem to solve. But that is what the financial system does. It's a key role of the financial system to provide a channel through which savings can go from the hands of the people who are saving money, but they don't really want to do the investing, into the hands of the people who have ideas. They want to build factories. They want to buy machinery. They don't have the funds to do it. Saving is one critical part. Investment, remember, investment refers to the purchase of new capital goods. So you've got the automaker who's going to build the new plant. He's got to purchase lots and lots of equipment in order to build that factory so that it can produce new cars in the future. And how's he going to get the funds to build the factory? That's what we're going to be focusing on in this chapter. Savings are necessary for capital accumulation. As I said, to produce the new capital requires investment, and investment, people doing the investing, they have to acquire funding in order for them to make those investments. The more capital an economy can invest, the greater its GDP per capita. That's really what we were saying in chapter 28. Connecting savers and borrowers increases gains from trade and smooths economic growth. This is an interesting graph or chart here. Think of on one side, you got the people who want to save. They're not spending all their money. They want to save. When you save, you think about why do you save? You don't save because you say, well, I just don't want anything more. You save so that in the future, you'll be able to spend that money. So you've got the people on one side who are supplying savings. They're saving money and you're going to make those savings available to other people. On the other hand, other side, you have borrowers, people who have a demand for savings. They want to buy those new investment goods now, but they don't have the funds. Savers are willing to lend the funds because notice both sides think they're going to benefit. The borrowers are getting the funds that they want so they can make investments. The savers are providing those funds to the borrowers because they're going to get some kind of reward. Interest would be one example of that. And what we have here in the middle is the financial system. Having a developed financial system is one of the absolute necessities of having a modern economy. The financial system is absolutely critical to having a high standard of living. But the financial system is extremely complicated. And we're not going to get into the details of the financial system in this course, certainly not in this chapter, but this will give you a broad overview of what the financial system does. It is very, very important. Some people have a very negative view of banks and finance. They say, banking, that's not productive. They're just moving money around. Well, bankers are moving money around. That's very productive, right? Because when you're moving, think about what money represents. It represents purchasing power. So when the bankers are moving money from the savers into the hands of the borrowers, the investors, that is moving purchasing power around. And that is enabling the people with ideas to make investments to fund their ideas. And that's a very, very important role. We're going to see for all of the banks, all of the firms in the financial sector, they all serve the same primary function. They are serving as a channel or a bridge to enable savings from one part of the economy to flow into the hands of the people who have a demand for those savings or a use for those savings. And you can roughly break the financial system into the banking sector, bond markets, and stock markets. At the end of the chapter, we'll say a little bit about the details of these three. They do get very complicated. We're not going to go into the details, but there are huge benefits of having a general understanding of what the financial system does. Because you're going to be making investments in personal investments. You're going to be saving for a house, saving for retirement, and you need to have a general idea of how the economy and how the financial system operates. Don't, you're going to feel very, very confused and disoriented as you go through life. You don't want that. You don't have to understand everything about financial markets to understand some basic things that really will help you a lot in making sense of what is going on in the world. Once we get over to chapter 33, and 34 and 35. Then we will turn directly to the banking system, talk about the Federal Reserve, and give you some details on how that operates. But in this chapter, we're just talking about the very basics of you've got people who want to save, businesses, and households who want to borrow. How are they brought together? How does that work? Okay, so obviously, from what we said, savings are important and investment is important. What are the factors that affect the supply of savings? Well, the book says there are four major factors that determine the supply of savings, and these are listed here: smoothing consumption, patience, tax incentives or disincentives, and interest rates. This is a summary. Now we're going to look at each one of these individually. Okay. Smoothing consumption. Okay. The idea here is that essentially for everybody, your income isn't constant over time. Okay. When you're in college, and especially if you're not working, your income is very low. You get into out of college, you start working, your income goes up. As you work longer, you get more experience, your income keeps going up. At some point, you retire. You're not working anymore. Your income goes down. Without smoothing of consumption, that would mean that when you're in college and your income is low, you're young, and you're not earning very much, then your standard of living would have to be very, very low. And then when you are in your working years, your income is high, then your consumption would go way up. But then without some kind of smoothing, when you retired and stopped working and your income plummeted, then your consumption would have to plummet and you would just live in poverty when you're old. Well, that's not the way most people want to live. Right? So people tend to try to smooth their consumption. When you're young, it's not unusual to borrow. And you borrow so that you can consume more than your current income. And then as you get older and your income goes up, then you pay back those loans and you start saving, which means you are spending less than your income. And you do that so that when you get older and you retire and you're not earning income anymore, you don't have to fall into poverty because you've saved enough during the working years so that your consumption can continue to be at a relatively high level. So since most people don't want to fall into poverty when they retire, it makes sense to use some type of consumption smoothing, and saving is the way that you can do that. Saving also provides a cushion for unemployment or unexpected health problems and other problems. This is not a course in personal investing. It's not my job to give investing advice, but if there was one thing I would say would be it's a very good idea to save funds for an emergency or unexpected events. Most of us have a tendency to look at our income and say, what's the most that I can spend and not get into trouble? And we assume nothing's going to go wrong. That's a very bad assumption because you don't know what's going to go wrong, but it's a pretty good bet that some unexpected things are going to happen. I don't know which ones, but some unexpected things we should expect to happen. And if you have a pretty good emergency fund, then those unexpected things don't have to cause a terrible crisis for you. If you have only enough savings to get you through half a month and something goes wrong, then you encounter problems. When I was at Northwestern about 10 years ago, the university went through a cataclysmic financial crisis, and they were looking for ways to cut expenses. And one way they found to do it was to shift my department into another college. And they decided we really don't need somebody with a PhD teaching economics. Pretty much anybody can do that. And so they shifted me into another college, out of the College of Business, and they cut my salary by 50%. That's a pretty significant change in income. But I had a pretty significant emergency fund. And so even though it was a huge cut in my income, it didn't involve a huge drop in our standard of living. And it was only temporary. Eventually, LSUA decided they did want an economist with a PhD teaching here, so that's why I came here. And always been very happy that I made that move. But it's a good example of how a huge change in your income doesn't have to have a devastating effect on you if you have been living relatively frugally and you have a sufficient emergency fund. And most of us tend to not have enough of a fund. And I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I do believe there's a potential for significant problems to continue. So I would encourage you to have an adequate emergency fund so that when unexpected things happen, it doesn't feel like the end of the world. Okay, so we're dealing with the question, what are the factors that affect savings? First, we said that consumption's moving. People save so that when they retire in the future, they will have money to maintain their consumption. They don't go into poverty. Impatience was the second factor that was listed. Most individuals prefer to consume now rather than later. If I said, I'll give you $5 today or I'll give you $5 in a month, almost certainly you would say, I'll take it now. We like to get things sooner rather than later. And the more impatient a person, the more likely that their savings rate will be low. So they want to go ahead and consume it. They want to enjoy it now. But if you're not impatient and you can save money, you earn a return on that, and in the future you will have even more money to consume. Criminals, addicts, alcoholics, and smokers all tend to discount the future more heavily. Some people do have a huge problem in discounting the future, and not taking the future into account. I remember, I don't think have I referred to the concept of time horizon? That's a very useful concept. Let me define it here. Time horizon refers to how far into the future a person looks when making decisions. How far into the future a person looks when making decisions. So a person with a long time horizon, when they decide what to do today, how to spend their money today, they're thinking about what will be the implications of this, not just today, but tomorrow, next week, next year. But from the short time horizon, they're just thinking about the present. And we're hearing of a lady who was a custodian at a university in Mississippi. And she worked there for years as a custodian. And she didn't earn a lot of money, but she saved and she invested. And her investments did very well. And when she retired, she had a lot of money. She gave over $100,000 to the university to fund scholarships. She had a very long time horizon. When she had $1 and she could spend this on some coffee today, or she could save it, she was willing to save it because she said, if I save this today and a little tomorrow and a little the next day, eventually I'll have enough to make a difference. She was thinking long term. Another individual who was apparently addicted to some type of drug wanted a fix now. The only asset that she had was a pickup truck that was almost new. She sold it for $500. And when she sold it, she did not take her young child out of the back. She just sold it. She was thinking, how can I get what I want right now? How am I going to feel about this tomorrow when I don't have my pickup for my child? Well, she wasn't thinking about that. That didn't count. It's a very short time horizon. The longer a time horizon a person has, the more they're willing to make sacrifices in the present in order to get benefits in the future. So somebody has a very short time horizon, they're not going to save very much. They have a long time horizon, they're willing to save because they're willing to make a sacrifice today because they know that's going to provide benefits to them in the future. Time preference, that's simply another term referring to the fact that we'd rather have things now than have to wait for them. Then the last factor that we listed as being a determinant of savings is the interest rate. And this is the one we're going to focus on. Think about what the interest rate is. From the perspective of a saver, the interest rate is the reward you get for saving. If the interest rate is 5% and you're a saver, that means if you go to the bank, you deposit $100 in your savings account, then after a year, you don't have $100, you have $105. There's a reward for saving. If the interest rate goes up to 10%, what's happened to the reward for saving? It's gone up. And you have, when the interest rate goes up, that means there's a greater incentive to save money. And that is why the savings curve, the supply of savings or supply of loanable funds, is upward sloping. It's going to be very, very important. It reflects the fact that the interest rate represents the reward you get for saving money. And so the higher the interest rate, the more people are willing to save. That is a very important idea, because remember how this fits into what we said before. We're interested in living standards. For living standards to go up, we need more capital. To get more capital, we need investment. And for investment to take place, you have to have somebody who's willing to save money. So as the interest rate goes up, people are willing to save more money that can fund more investment. Savings isn't the whole story. You got a supply curve here. Anytime you see a supply curve, what should you expect? There's going to be a demand curve as well. This isn't the whole story, but it's an important part of the story. Okay? So you want to be sure that you understand the meaning of that upward sloping supply curve. Okay, now we're talking about the other side of the transaction. Why do people borrow? Well, one reason is people borrow is to, again, smooth consumption. When you're young, you want to go to college, but you borrow money to finance that spending. You don't have the income to have a place to live, to eat, and pay your tuition, so you borrow. And that makes perfect sense to do. You're borrowing now so that you're going to have benefits in the future. Borrowing moves some sacrifices into future periods when students have a job. Okay? When you borrow, think about what happens. You're getting money now, so you get to have more consumption now, but there's a sacrifice, but that's going to be in the future. And that's if you're borrowing in order to finance something like a college education, it's probably a pretty good thing to do. If you are borrowing money so you can go to Las Vegas and play the slot machines, probably not a good thing to do, because there's a sacrifice there. Okay? There's a sacrifice just like when you borrow money to go to college. But when you borrow to go to college, that makes you more productive. You're going to earn more in the future. So you can pay the interest on that loan out of the higher income you're going to have. If you borrow money to go to Las Vegas, well, you're going to have a sacrifice. You're going to have to repay that loan in the future. But going to Las Vegas didn't most likely did not increase your income. It probably lowered your wealth, and so it's going to have a negative long-term impact on your standard of living. So borrowing to finance investment type things is a reasonable thing to do. Other reasons that people borrow to finance large investments. You get out of school, you have a job, you want to buy a house. Right? You don't want to wait until your kids grow up to buy a house. You want to go ahead and buy the house, but you don't have the money. Well, what do? You borrow. Right? When you borrow, you are spending more today. There's going to be cost in the future. You have to pay interest. Right? But it's worth it. It's worth it to you to do that because you get to enjoy your house for a longer period of time. You get to enjoy it when you have the kids there. People borrow also because of tax incentives or disincentives. The tax code is very, very complicated. And there are a number of ways that taxes can create, especially incentives to borrow. When the government says that interest that you pay is tax deductible, well, then that reduces the cost of you of borrowing. And that means you have a greater incentive to borrow. So we're not going to go into the details of those kinds of things, but just remember that taxes do have an effect, an incentive effect on how much people will want to borrow. Also, the influence of the business cycle on the profit outlook of businesses. Okay? Go back to our example of the auto company that wants to build a $3 billion factory. Let's say they haven't decided whether they should do that or not. They're thinking about it. You're only going, think about what would you do? You're running a business. Are you going to run out and borrow $3 billion without giving it a lot of thought? Borrowing money, $10,000 for a car, that's a pretty big decision. Imagine promising to repay $3 billion. You're not going to do that unless you think about it very carefully and you conclude, no, if we spend $3 billion on these plans, it's going to enable us to make, it's going to bring in $4 billion or $5 billion. If you think it's going to be profitable, then you're willing to borrow the money and build that factory. If you think it's not going to be profitable, if you think the demand for the product is not going to be there, then you're not going to borrow the money. Well, here we have the term business cycle. What we said about that in chapter 26. The business cycle, that's a phrase that refers to the short-run fluctuations in the real GDP. If we put time on the horizontal axis and put real GDP on the vertical axis, we said the trend line, which shows us on average what is going to happen or what happens. We know that real output increases at about 3% per year. So we said what happens from one year to the next is all over the place. The actual path of GDP is something more like that. Sometimes GDP increases faster than 3%. Sometimes it declines. And we said when output is declining, that's what we mean by a recession. Right? Well, if you believe you're running this auto company, if you believe that we're at a point like this, then output is about to really take off. So you're going to think the economy is about to boom. People are going to have a lot more income. They're going to want to buy a lot of cars. you're likely to conclude, yeah, it's worth building this factory. It's worth borrowing the $3 billion to finance building that factory. On the other hand, if you believe we're at a point like this and output's about to go down, people are about to lose their jobs, incomes are likely to fall. When people have less income, they cut back on buying cars. So if a businesses believe we're about to go into recession, then they're probably going to cancel this auto factory. They're going to conclude this is not the right time to be spending $3 billion to build an auto factory because people aren't going to buy the cars it would produce. So whether you borrow the money and build the factory will depend on what you think the future looks like. If you think things are going to improve, then you may build it. If you think things are about to deteriorate, then you're much less likely to build it. Also, I would make one other point here. Think about investment, business decisions about investment right now. Okay? Got a lot of uncertainty, okay? And part of that uncertainty has to do with the election. We don't know who's going to be elected president. We do know they're likely to follow different kinds of policies. So if you're a business trying to decide how to invest and what to invest in, you don't know what to do. One thing we can say is that once the election is over, once we know who's going to be president, then there will be less uncertainty because we will know, okay, this is the person who's going to be directing policy in the future. And so there will be a benefit of having that having a reduction in uncertainty. Not saying it doesn't matter who gets elected, but whoever gets elected, there will be a benefit that, well, at least now we know which direction we're going to go. And so in some ways, the economy will improve because right now there's kind of we don't know. We don't know how to invest, but we don't know which kind of policies we're going to be following. Also, other reasons for borrowing, government. When the government is running a deficit, a federal budget deficit, which is an important distinction to make. When you hear the word deficit, always ask yourself, are we talking about a federal budget deficit, or are we talking about a trade deficit? We talked about a trade deficit before. We said that's where our imports are greater than our exports. It's a trade deficit. When we're talking about a budget deficit, we're talking about the balance between how much the government is spending and how much they are receiving in tax revenue. So when we're running a federal budget deficit, it means the government is spending more during the year than they are receiving in tax revenue. Okay? I believe I heard the other day that for the year, it's estimated that the budget deficit is going to be $3.1 trillion. $3.1 trillion. That is dramatically larger than any federal budget deficit we've had in the past. For our purposes here, why is that deficit important? Well, think about it. If somebody is spending more than their income, how can you do that? How can you spend more than the income you're getting? You have to borrow. And that's what the government has to do. When they spend more than the tax revenue they're receiving, which is essentially every year, they have to borrow money. Later, we'll talk a little bit about some of the details of how they do that. for now, just recognize when the government runs a larger deficit, that means the demand for savings, the demand for loanable funds is going to go up. You want to borrow money for a school loan or for a house loan or for a car loan, that is a demand for borrowing. When the government wants to fund the deficit, that also is a demand for borrowing or for savings. Right? And all of these things have an impact. And the last thing that is a determinant of why of how much people will borrow is interest rates. Let's see, and here, this is just another chart showing you the idea of smoothing, right? That when you're young, you tend to borrow money. In the prime working years, you tend to save, paying off the loans from earlier in your savings so that in your retirement years, you can spend more than your current income is at that point in time. That's a way of smoothing consumption over time. The thing we've already talked about, demand to borrow. And we had the supply of savings. It's an upward sloping curve. Here we have the demand to borrow. Notice similarity with the previous graph. Okay? On the horizontal axis, we have the quantity, okay? Quantity of funds that are either being saved or borrowed. And you could also call this the quantity of loanable funds. Okay? People who are saving are supplying funds that can be loaned out. People who are borrowing are demanding those loanable funds. Okay? So you've got both groups interacting in the market for loanable funds. And notice, just like with our savings supply curve, the variable on the vertical axis is the interest rate. Now, the supply curve, what was the slope of the supply curve? It was positively sloped, okay? Because when the interest rate goes up, that led to an increase in the quantity of funds people would be willing to save, would be willing to lend. Okay? Why? Because for savers, the interest rate is the reward you get. Okay? You ask savers, would you rather the interest rate be 5% or 10%? They say 10%, because the interest rate is a reward the savers are getting for saving and then lending. Borrowers don't have the same perspective. You ask them, you want a 10% loan or a 5% loan, they are not going to say 10%, because from the perspective of the borrower, what is the interest rate? From the borrower's perspective, the interest rate is the cost of borrowing the money. If you are going to borrow $100 per year, and if the interest rate is 10%, then at the end of the year, you're going to have to pay $10 of interest. That's a cost. If the interest rate is only 5%, at the end of the year, you only have to pay $5 of interest. Okay? So the borrower and the saver have totally opposite perspectives. The saver says the higher the interest rate, the better. The borrower says the lower the interest rate, the better. So that gives us points like this. If the interest rate is 10%, it's the cost of borrowing is relatively high. And so the amount of funds that borrowers will choose to borrow is going to be relatively low. Here, $190 billion. This point, further down on the demand to borrow curve, shows us that if the interest rate is only 5%, and borrowers want to borrow an additional $110 billion. borrowers are responding to the change in the cost of borrowing. As the interest rate goes down, cost of borrowing is lower, so more people are going to choose to borrow. That's what the negative sort of there is telling us. Any question on that? Okay, when we talk about the market for loanable funds, we're really just talking about what we are seeing here. We're talking about the interaction of the people who want to save and lend and the people who want to borrow. Okay? And shouldn't be surprised, we're going to put supply and demand together. Shouldn't be surprised if they intersect. When they intersect, what are we going to call that? Equilibrium. One of the reasons that supply and demand analysis is so powerful, and why we put so much emphasis on it in chapter 3 and chapter 4, is because it applies to all kinds of markets. Anytime you have an exchange, whether it's gasoline or corn or wheat or loanable funds, you've got a supply curve, you've got a demand curve. You can use that framework to think about what's going to happen. So here, even though we're talking about loanable funds for the first time today, we don't have to develop a totally new framework. We can use the same framework that we used before. Okay? And here, you can see at the intersection, we are going to call that the equilibrium interest rate. And everything we said about equilibrium before still applies here. Equilibrium is a state in which there's no tendency for change. We said that there are forces that will push us to that equilibrium because when we're in equilibrium, the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. In equilibrium, you have a state of balance where the quantity of funds that savers are willing to supply is exactly equal to the quantity of funds that demanders want to borrow. So you have a balance. Key idea here, in our general model, going back to chapter 3 and 4, we always had quantity on the horizontal axis. And what did we have on the vertical axis? Always had the price. Well, when we're talking about the market for loanable funds, we didn't put price here. We have interest rate. The interest rate is the price. The interest rate is what is the price you pay in order to borrow money. And the interest rate is the reward, or is the price that the saver gets for supplying savings. So when you see interest rate, just remember that really is representing price. It's the same framework. Price on the vertical and quantity on the horizontal. And just back as in chapter 3 and 4 with basic supply and demand, how did we know we would end up in equilibrium? Well, it's because if we have a surplus or shortage, the price would adjust to get us to equilibrium. And it's exactly the same idea here. If the interest rate is above the equilibrium, we're going to have an imbalance. We'll see that in the graph in just a moment. We have a surplus of savings, and the interest rate is going to change. Just as the price in the market for, say, gasoline adjusts to get us to equilibrium, in the market for loanable funds, it is the interest rate that is going to adjust to get us to equilibrium. As here, you've got Remember, anytime you look at a graph, stop, think carefully, what do I have here? We got savings and borrowing here, or say the quantity of loanable funds. We got the interest rate up here, which is the price of loanable funds. We got the savings curve, which shows us the amount that people are willing to save and to lend at various interest rates. We got the demand to borrow curve, or the demand for loanable funds, which shows you how much people want to borrow at different interest rates. And here, let's say we're told that the interest rate is 10%. One of the things you want to be able to do, take a graph like this. If I tell you the interest rate is 10%, what can you tell me? Well, very clear what you need to do. You say, well, if the interest rate is 10%, then I read over to the demand curve, I read down, this would be the quantity demanded of loanable funds. That's the quantity that borrowers are going to want to borrow. At high interest rate, people are going to want to borrow $190 billion. What do we do now? We say, well, yes, borrowers are going to want to borrow 190 billion at that rate, but what are lenders going to want to do? What are savers going to want to do? So we read over horizontally to the supply curve, we read down, and that gives us the quantity of loanable funds supplied, the amount of savings that will be available. So we can then say, well, if the interest rate is at 10%, we're going to have an imbalance, because you can have savers who are willing to lend $280 billion. They want to lend that much. Borrowers say, oh, that interest rate, that's high. We only want to borrow 190 billion. So quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, which means we have a gap here. We have an imbalance. What do we call that kind of a gap? It's a surplus, right? Or excess supply. We're just using the same model from chapter 3 and chapter 4. We have a surplus, and the surplus would be the difference between 190 and 280. So that would be a $90 billion surplus. Savers want to lend more than borrowers want to borrow. And anytime you have a surplus in standard demand and supply model, the price goes down. Here, the interest rate is the price. And so the interest rate is automatically going to adjust. And as the interest rate goes down, what do savers think about that? Are they glad it's going down? No, because it's not, they like the high interest rate. It's a high reward. But it is going to go down. As it goes down, it's not as profitable to, or rewarding to save and to lend. And so the quantity of funds that will be supplied is going to drop. On the other hand, the borrowers, they think it's great that the interest rate is going down. As the interest rate goes down, the cost of borrowing is getting lower. And so they are going to choose to borrow more. So the interest rate drops. Savers will supply a smaller quantity. Borrowers will want to borrow more. As those two are getting closer together, the surplus is getting smaller. Interest rate drops until we get to equilibrium where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. The idea here is that the interest rate is determined by how much people want to save and how much people want to borrow. Interest rate is a market determined rate. That is a very, very key idea. Okay? When we talk about interest rates, there's some complexity I need to mention, and that is that if you read the news, you will hear a lot of talk about interest rates, and much of that will talk about, well, the Fed is going to raise interest rates, or the Fed is going to lower interest rates. And when you hear those things, it sounds like, well, no, the interest rates are determined by the Fed. What we're saying here is that interest rates are determined by the supply and demand for savings. Well, which is it? Well, that's why it's confusing. It's both. What we have here is absolutely correct, but the complication is that the Federal Reserve has the ability to intervene in these markets. Okay? So the Fed can shift the supply curve or the demand curve. So yes, the interest rates are market determined, but on the other hand, if the Fed, the central bank, if they don't like interest rates, the Fed can take actions that will shift some of these curves, and that will change interest rates. And later on, we'll get into the things the Fed does, and they are doing a lot these days. But for now, we won't be talking about the Fed. We'll just be talking about the interest rates as being determined by savings and borrowing. Almost out of time. If there's a shortage of vulnerable funds, what happens? What's it going to be? If there's a shortage, then interest rates are going to go up. In our example, there was a surplus, interest rates go down. Changes in economic conditions will shift the supply or demand curve. And when either of those shift, it's going to change interest rates, and it's going to change the amount of investing, and it's going to change the amount of savings. Next time, we'll start with this example. What if people become more thrifty? What if people decide, I'm not as impatient as before, I want to save more so I can have more in the future? That will have predictable effects on interest rates. We'll look at several other examples where we can use our model and we can use it to predict how various events will change interest rates. And as we think about that, consider one question. Is it possible that interest rates could be negative? We'll eventually talk about that. That's tricky. Okay, let me know if you have any questions.
Professor Jones, one question. Did you take attendance?
I'm sorry?
Did you take attendance, Professor Jones?
I didn't call attendance. I'm going to look at the Moodle participation list, and I will get it.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, sir. Thank you.